For all of human history, for every civilization that ever built a city or wrote a poem or looked up at the stars and wondered, the existence of the dinosaurs was completely unknown. Not suspected. Not mythologized. Not even dimly intuited through the fossil fragments that had been turning up in quarries and cliff faces and riverbeds since the beginning of recorded history, and that had been variously interpreted as the bones of giants and dragons and the victims of Noah's flood and the random productions of a creative earth. But never, not once in 3,000 years of recorded human thought, correctly identified as the remains of creatures that had dominated the earth for 170 million years before disappearing 66 million years ago in a catastrophe so complete and so sudden that it reset the entire trajectory of life on this planet. The world before dinosaurs were discovered was a world with a history of 6,000 years, the specific biblical chronology that educated Europeans in the early 19th century understood as the age of the earth, derived from the specific genealogical arithmetic of the Old Testament. In that world, fossils were curiosities or mistakes or evidence of the flood. They were not the remains of creatures from an unimaginable past, because an unimaginable past did not exist in the intellectual framework of the age. The world after dinosaurs were discovered was a world with a history of hundreds of millions of years, a world in which the present was not the climax of creation but a recent episode in a vastly longer story, a story in which creatures of incomprehensible strangeness had lived and died and been replaced by other creatures, in which the specific forms of life visible today were not fixed eternal types but the current expressions of a process of change that had been operating across a timescale that the human mind struggles to contain. The discovery of the first dinosaurs changed everything. Not immediately. The specific intellectual revolution that the discovery set in motion took decades to complete and required the parallel development of geology, paleontology, and eventually the theory of evolution to reach its full expression. But the specific moment when the first gigantic ancient bones were recognized as the remains of creatures previously unknown to science, when the world first understood that something this large and this strange had once walked the earth, was one of the most profound conceptual disruptions in the entire history of human thought. And it happened in England. In a limestone quarry in Oxfordshire. In the first decades of the 19th century. And it was recognized, tentatively, partially, incompletely, but genuinely, by a country clergyman who was also a geologist and who had the specific combination of scientific training and intellectual courage to say what he believed the bones represented rather than what the prevailing intellectual tradition said they should be. His name was William Buckland. And the animal he named, Megalosaurus, the great lizard, was the first dinosaur to receive a scientific name in the history of science. But before Buckland and before Megalosaurus, there was the long, strange, intellectually productive prehistory of fossil discovery, in which the human species encountered the physical evidence of the dinosaurs repeatedly without being able to interpret what it was seeing. The ancient Greeks and Romans had their own encounters with large fossil bones. The specific dry conditions of the Mediterranean region and the Middle East had preserved fossil remains of Miocene and Pleistocene megafauna in surface exposures that ancient travelers and farmers and quarrymen encountered regularly. Adrienne Mayer, the classical folklorist and historian of science, has argued persuasively that many of the creature myths of the ancient world, the griffin, the giant of the earth, the monster bones that ancient writers described finding in various locations, were inspired by genuine fossil discoveries whose ancient interpreters lacked the conceptual framework to understand them as such. The Chinese fossil tradition, which described fossil bones as dragon bones and used them in traditional medicine, was encountering genuine dinosaur fossils in the specific geological outcrops of China that are among the richest dinosaur-bearing deposits in the world, and had been doing so for millennia. The specific irony that some of the most important dinosaur fossils in the world were being ground into medicine powder for centuries before Western paleontology recognized them as the remains of ancient animals is one of the more poignant intersections of cultural tradition and scientific discovery in the history of natural history. The European encounter with fossil bones in the geological deposits of England and France and Germany in the 17th and early 18th centuries produced the specific intellectual ferment that eventually led to dinosaur discovery. Not because anyone in 1700 understood that dinosaurs had existed, but because the accumulation of fossil material in the collections of learned societies and wealthy gentlemen created the specific pressure on existing intellectual frameworks that eventually produced the conceptual breakthrough. Robert Plot, the first keeper of the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, published in 1677 the first scientific illustration of what was almost certainly a dinosaur bone. The object in question was the lower end of a femur, a thigh bone, discovered in a limestone quarry near the village of Cornwell in Oxfordshire, a bone so large that Plot correctly noted it exceeded the dimensions of any living animal he was aware of. He eventually concluded that it was the bone of a giant human, a conclusion that the biblical tradition of antediluvian giants made intellectually available to him, and moved on. He had held a dinosaur bone in his hands in 1677 and had not had the conceptual tools to understand what he was holding. The intellectual framework that made dinosaur discovery possible was geology. The specific development of geological science in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The work of James Hutton, whose theory of the Earth argued in 1788 that the geological record demonstrated an Earth of incomprehensible age, of William Smith, whose systematic mapping of English geological strata in the 1790s and 1800s established the principle of stratigraphy and demonstrated that different rock layers contained characteristic fossil assemblages, of Georges Cuvier, whose anatomical analysis of large fossil bones in Paris in the 1790s and 1800s established the principle of extinction, that some fossil species no longer existed, created the specific intellectual environment in which the discovery of an entirely new class of ancient animal was conceivable. Cuvier was the pivotal figure. His demonstration that some fossil bones belonged to animals with no living representatives, that extinction was a real phenomenon, that the Earth's past had contained creatures no longer present on its surface, was the specific conceptual revolution without which the recognition of dinosaurs as a distinct ancient group was impossible. Before Cuvier, the prevailing intellectual tradition assumed that no species had ever gone extinct, that God's creation was complete and that any apparently unknown fossil creature must have a living representative somewhere in the unexplored regions of the Earth. After Cuvier, extinction was an established fact of natural history, and the discovery of creatures entirely unlike anything alive became conceivable. William Buckland was the first reader of geology at Oxford University, a position created in 1818 specifically for the emerging scientific discipline, and a Fellow of the Geological Society of London whose work on fossil bones in the limestone caves of Yorkshire and elsewhere had established him as one of the most accomplished geological observers in Britain. He was also a clergyman of the Church of England, the specific combination of religious and scientific commitment that characterized many of the most important naturalists of the early 19th century and that required the specific intellectual flexibility of someone who could hold both a traditional religious worldview and an emerging scientific one without the cognitive dissonance becoming incapacitating. The Megalosaurus bones had been accumulating in the collections of the Ashmolean Museum and in the private collections of Oxfordshire landowners for years. Fragments of jaw, teeth, vertebrae, limb bones, found in the Stonesfield slate quarries near Woodstock in Oxfordshire, a limestone formation of the Middle Jurassic period that had been producing fossil material since the 17th century. The specific combination of the slate quarrying industry, which split the stone along its natural planes of stratification, exposing the fossils preserved within, and the proximity of Oxford with its collections and its learned societies created the conditions for the recognition of the Megalosaurus material. Buckland examined the collected bones in 1818 and 1819, consulting with Cuvier in Paris, who confirmed that the material was genuinely unlike anything known from the fossil record, and with the comparative anatomist William Clift, who helped him understand the specific skeletal architecture of the creature from its fragmentary remains. His analysis produced the specific recognition that he was dealing with a large extinct terrestrial reptile, not a marine creature like the ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs already being found in British cliffs, not a crocodilian, not a lizard, but something genuinely new. He presented his findings to the Geological Society of London in 1824, publishing the formal scientific description of Megalosaurus bucklandii in the Transactions of the Geological Society, and in doing so gave the first formal scientific name to a dinosaur. The paper is remarkable for its scientific caution and its scientific courage simultaneously. Buckland was careful not to overclaim, describing what the bones actually showed rather than speculating beyond the evidence, while simultaneously recognizing and asserting the genuinely revolutionary nature of what the bones represented. Megalosaurus was approximately 9 meters long and estimated to weigh approximately 1,000 kilograms, a bipedal predatory theropod of the Middle Jurassic period, a creature that had walked the shallow tropical lagoons and the forests of what is now Oxfordshire approximately 166 million years ago. The specific reconstruction available to Buckland in 1824, working from partial skeletal material with no complete skeleton and no living relatives to guide the reconstruction, was necessarily incomplete and in some respects incorrect. The early Victorian reconstructions of Megalosaurus depicted it as a massive quadrupedal lizard-like creature walking on 4 legs, the specific error that the Crystal Palace dinosaur sculptures of 1854 immortalized and that later, more complete fossil discoveries eventually corrected. Mary Anning, the fossil hunter of Lyme Regis, whose discoveries of the ichthyosaur in 1811 and the plesiosaur in 1823 and the pterosaur in 1828 established the existence of the Mesozoic marine reptile fauna that coexisted with the terrestrial dinosaurs, was finding the specific fossil evidence that the geological record of Britain was laying before anyone who knew how to look. Anning was not formally educated. She was the daughter of a Dorset carpenter who had taught her the specific practical skills of fossil hunting, reading the cliff faces, timing the tidal exposures of the fossil-bearing strata, understanding the specific fragility of the material and the specific techniques needed to extract it intact, and whose death when she was 11 had left the family in poverty that fossil selling helped to alleviate. She was one of the most important natural historians of the 19th century and received almost no formal recognition during her lifetime. The scientific papers that described her discoveries were published by the men who bought her fossils and examined them in the learned societies that she, as a working-class woman, could not join. The specific injustice of her position in the history of paleontology, the woman who found the creatures and the men who named them, has been extensively documented in recent decades and has generated the long-overdue recognition that her contributions were as foundational as those of any of her more formally credited contemporaries. Gideon Mantell was the Sussex physician who found the iguanodon, the second dinosaur to receive a scientific name, in 1822. The specific mythology of the discovery, that his wife Mary Ann was walking beside his carriage on a Sussex road and saw the fossilized teeth among some road-mending gravel, recognizing them as something unusual and showing them to her husband, is one of the most famous stories in the history of paleontology, and like most famous stories, its specific accuracy has been questioned by historians. What is not questioned is that Mantell, like Buckland and Anning, was one of the specific small community of early 19th century English fossil hunters who collectively built the empirical foundation on which the concept of the dinosaurs was eventually constructed. The person who constructed it, who coined the word dinosaur and who recognized that Megalosaurus and Iguanodon and Hylaeosaurus were not merely large extinct reptiles but a distinct and previously unknown group of ancient animals, was Richard Owen. Owen was the most formidable anatomist of his generation, the founder of the Natural History Museum in London, and one of the most intellectually dominating and personally difficult figures in the history of Victorian science. He was also, famously, one of the most vehement opponents of Darwin's theory of evolution, a opposition whose specific intellectual content and whose personal dimension have been analysed by historians in terms that are rarely flattering to Owen. But in 1842, Owen gave the dinosaurs their name. In a report to the British Association for the Advancement of Science, he proposed the term Dinosauria, from the Greek words for terrible and lizard, to describe the group of large extinct reptiles that included Megalosaurus, Iguanodon, and Hylaeosaurus, arguing that these animals shared a specific combination of anatomical features that distinguished them from all other reptiles and that justified classifying them as a distinct group. The name was adopted. The dinosaurs had a name. The subsequent century and 3/4 of dinosaur discovery, from the bone wars of the American West in the 1870s and 1880s, when the rival paleontologists Othniel Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope competed with a bitterness and a recklessness that produced both extraordinary discoveries and extraordinary destruction of fossil material. Through the discoveries of the Gobi Desert and the Cretaceous beds of Montana and the late Jurassic beds of Tanzania and the early Cretaceous beds of China, to the revolution in understanding triggered by the 1964 discovery of Deinonychus by John Ostrom and the subsequent recognition that birds are living dinosaurs, has transformed the understanding of the dinosaurs from the slow, cold-blooded, lizard-like creatures of Owen's first reconstruction to the fast, warm-blooded, feathered, socially complex animals that modern paleontology has revealed. The feathers. This is the discovery that has done most to transform the popular understanding of dinosaurs in recent decades. The specific evidence, concentrated in the exquisitely preserved fossil deposits of the Liaoning province of northeastern China, that many theropod dinosaurs were covered in feathers, that the specific evolutionary line that produced birds passed through the theropod dinosaurs, and that the birds visible today are not merely the descendants of the dinosaurs but are themselves dinosaurs, the surviving members of the group that Vesuvius's metaphorical equivalent 66 million years ago could not entirely extinguish. The asteroid that ended the non-avian dinosaurs, the specific impactor whose 6-mile-wide mass struck the Yucatan Peninsula at approximately 20 kilometers per second 66 million years ago, releasing an energy equivalent to approximately a billion atomic bombs, triggering the global winter of dust and debris that killed the photosynthetic base of the food chain and with it the large animals who depended on it, left alive the small, feathered, warm-blooded theropods that eventually gave rise to every bird alive today. Every bird is a dinosaur. The sparrow on the windowsill, the heron in the marsh, the chicken in the farmyard. They are all dinosaurs, specifically theropod dinosaurs of the lineage that survived the end Cretaceous extinction event and diversified across 66 million years of evolution into the 10,000 species of bird alive today. William Buckland held a Megalosaurus femur in his hands in 1818 and recognized something genuinely new. He could not possibly have imagined, what the recognition would eventually lead to. The specific intellectual revolution that began with the Stonesfield slate quarries of Oxfordshire has produced a transformation in human understanding of the history of life on Earth as profound as the Copernican revolution in understanding the structure of the solar system. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Life has been here for approximately 3.5 billion years. The dinosaurs ruled the land for 170 million years, from approximately 230 million years ago to 66 million years ago, a span of time so vast that the entire history of the human species, from the first Homo sapiens in Africa to the present day, fits into it approximately 800 times. And the descendants of the dinosaurs, the birds, are here now, singing in the trees, riding the thermals, diving into the oceans, and occasionally sitting on the edge of a Jurassic limestone quarry in Oxfordshire looking down at the spot where the bones of their ancient relatives are still waiting to be found. The quarry is still there. The limestone is still there. And the bones, somewhere in the specific Jurassic limestone of the English Midlands, are still there too. Waiting, as they have been waiting for 166 million years, for the next person with the right eyes to find them.